Think about what truly sets human intelligence apart. It's not just raw processing power, is it?
No, not at all.
It's our adaptability, how we learn from just tiny amounts of data, that intuitive common sense.
Yeah, and explainability too. Understanding why we do things.
Exactly.
Right.
And applying knowledge across totally different situations. You have to wonder if current AI is missing some fundamental piece of the puzzle.
That's really the core question, isn't it? I mean, AI has made incredible strides, obviously.
For sure.
But these gaps, they persist. And they suggest we might be overlooking a really key aspect of how intelligence actually, well, functions. Human thought isn't static calculation.
Right.
It's dynamic. It unfolds over time, constantly learning, adjusting.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we're diving deep into a fascinating new AI architecture today, one that aims to address precisely this. It's called the Continuous Thought Machine, or CTM, and it proposes a really fundamental shift in how AI might operate.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The central idea is that current AI often treats time as, well, almost an afterthought.
How so?
It focuses on snapshots of data, maybe sequential information, but without truly capturing the continuous internal dynamics of neural activity. And the creators of the CTM believe this is a major barrier, a barrier to achieving more human-like intelligence.
So the mission for us today, for this deep dive, is to understand how the CTM fundamentally changes that approach. How does it make time a central pillar of its design, and what are the implications?
Exactly. We're going to explore how this CTM architecture explicitly models neural timing, how it envisions the evolution of neural activity not just as, say, a sequence of steps,
Right.
but as a continuous internal landscape, a space where something akin to thought can actually emerge and progress.
And for you, our listener, this whole exploration, it's based on a really compelling research paper that introduces and rigorously tests the CPM.
It's quite detailed.
So get ready, because here's where the conversation gets really interesting. Let's start with this fundamental concept. Why is making time central to AI so important? And how does the CTM actually, build this into its core structure?
Okay, so the core argument, as the researchers put it, is that by neglecting the crucial role of time and the inherent dynamism of neural activity.
That dynamism you mentioned.
Yeah, that dynamism. Current AI faces these fundamental limitations in reaching human-level intelligence. I mean, consider it. Our brains aren't static processors, right?
Definitely not.
They're constantly in flux, adapting, with activity patterns evolving in these intricate temporal sequences. The CTM is engineered to reflect this. It embeds neural timing directly into its architecture.
So instead of merely processing data from one stage to the next like a pipeline,
Right.
the CTM is actively modeling the ongoing evolution of the neural activity itself. That sounds like a pretty significant departure.
It is. A really key innovation here is what they call a decoupled internal dimension.
Decoupled internal dimension.
Yeah, imagine the AI having its own sort of internal dream sequence, if you like.
Yeah.
A continuous flow of activity that's somewhat independent of the immediate external input. It allows for deeper processing.
So it can think internally even if the input isn't changing.
Kind of, yes. CTM progresses through these discrete internal ticks within this dimension. And crucially, this isn't just about handling sequential data better. It's about leveraging this internal progression to construct complex, time-dependent patterns of neural activity.
I see.
And this directly aligns with a key biological principle, that the precise timing of neural events is critical for how our brains compute. It shifts AI from just processing sequences to embodying a continuous internal thought process. That's the key departure.
So it's almost like it has its own internal clock driving this thought process along. What other novel components allow it to function this way?
Well, another vital innovation is the concept of neuron-level models, or NLMs.
NLMs.
Yeah, think of these as going beyond the simple on-off switch of a traditional neuron, like a ReLU function or something.
Yeah.
Each neuron in the CTM evolves beyond just a simple activation. It possesses its own internal dynamics to process a history of signals.
A history.
Yeah. Unlike traditional networks, where a neuron's output is usually just determined by a static activation function applied to the current input.
Right.
In the CTM, each neuron has its own set of internal weights. And these weights let the neuron process not just the latest incoming signal, but a history of recent signals, the pre-activations, to figure out its next activation.
So each neuron has its own little mini processing unit that remembers past inputs. That sounds like it could lead to much richer behavior, right?
Precisely. And this leads to a fascinating emergent property.
Yeah.
The neural activation dynamics within the CTM become significantly more complex. They exhibit much greater variability compared to networks that rely on those static activation functions.
Got it. So we have this internal progression through time, the ticks and individual neurons that process information over time using these NLMs. How do these neurons then talk to each other in this time-sensitive system?
That's where the synapse model comes into play. Its job is to connect the neurons and generate those pre-activations we just talked about.
Okay.
The synapse model looks at the previous internal states of the neurons and also information it gets from attention mechanisms.
Ah, attention is involved too.
Yes, and it uses that to determine the incoming signals for the next internal tick. Interestingly, the researchers found that using a more sophisticated synapse model, they mentioned maybe something leveraging a UNet-like structure.
A UNet, like from image segmentation.
Yeah, that kind of architecture, known for capturing multi-scale information. They found using something like that led to improved performance across various tasks.
Huh.
It suggests that integrating temporal signals in a sophisticated way is pretty important.
A UNet for synapses. That's a clever idea. It implies that the way these time-aware neurons connect and influence each other also needs to be dynamic and nuanced. Now, you mentioned attention.
Yeah.
How does the CTM use that in its temporal processing?
Right, so the CTM employs attention mechanisms, much like other modern architectures. But it uses them to selectively focus on relevant parts of the input data at each internal tick.
Ah, so the focus can change over its internal thinking time.
Exactly. The output of this attention mechanism then feeds into the synapse model, influencing the pre-activations and then consequently the post-activations in the next step. It creates this feedback loop where the CTM can actively gather information from the input as its internal thought process unfolds over time.
Okay, so it's not just internally evolving in isolation, it's actively engaging with the data in a time-dependent way. That makes sense. Now, there's also this concept of neural synchronization.
Right.
What does that tell us about how the CTM works?
Neural synchronization in the CTM, it's basically a measure of how the recent activity patterns of different neurons relate to each other.
Like, are they firing together?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Specifically, it's calculated as the inner dot product between their post-activation histories. It's looking at the correlation of their recent activity traces.
Okay. That sounds computationally expensive if you do it for every pair of neurons.
It definitely can be, especially in larger networks. So to manage that cost, the CTM uses a technique called neuron pairing. It's essentially a way of subsampling these pairs, calculating synchronization only for a representative subset.
So it's looking at a sample of connections rather than every single one. Makes sense for efficiency.
Exactly. And here's a really interesting element. The CTM introduces learnable, exponentially decaying rescaling factors for these neuron pairs.
Learnable factors. What do they do?
Think of them as little knobs the AI can tweak. They let it decide how much it cares about its recent versus more distant memories or activity patterns when calculating synchronization.
Ah.
These decay rates allow the CTM to control how much influence past neural activity has on the current synchronization measure. A high decay rate means it emphasizes very recent activity, while a low rate gives more weight to longer-term history.
So it can learn to have a short-term or long-term memory of its own internal dynamics depending on what the task requires. That's neat.
Precisely. And the researchers observed something interesting here. While these learnable decay rates weren't heavily utilized for image classification on ImageNet,
Okay.
they became significantly more important for tasks demanding more sequential reasoning, like navigating those 2D mazes we'll talk about.
Ah, okay, so it adapts.
Yeah, it indicates the CTM can adapt its reliance on its own temporal dynamics based on the specific demands of the problem it's trying to solve.
Fascinating. So we have this architecture built around time with individual neurons processing temporal info, dynamic synapses connecting them, engaging with data through attention, and even learning to manage its internal temporal dependencies via synchronization. But how does this whole system actually learn to perform a task? What's the key to its training?
Right, the learning part. The CTM employs a unique loss function. It's specifically designed to optimize its performance across that internal thought dimension we discussed.
The ticks.
Exactly, the ticks. Instead of solely focusing on the final output at the very last internal tick, which is what many recurrent models might implicitly do,
Yeah.
the loss function dynamically gathers information from two critical points in the CTM's internal processing. The point where the error is lowest across all ticks, and the point where the CTM exhibits the highest confidence or certainty in its prediction across all ticks.
Huh. So it looks across the whole thinking process.
Yes. The key insight here seems to be that the CTM learns how to think effectively, not just what the final answer should be. It rewards effective internal computation throughout the process.
So it's not just about getting the right answer eventually. It's also rewarding itself for being confident and for having a low error at any stage during its internal thinking process.
Exactly, and this approach has several advantages. Firstly, it encourages the CTM to develop meaningful representations and perform useful computations throughout its internal progression, not just cramming everything in at the very end.
Makes sense.
Secondly, it naturally fosters a kind of curriculum learning effect. The model might initially rely on later ticks for complex processing, but gradually learns to make accurate predictions earlier for simpler inputs, because the loss function encourages that.
Ah, clever.
And thirdly, it enables the CTM to adapt its computational effort based on the difficulty of the data. Easier examples might quickly reach high certainty and low error early on.
While harder ones might need more internal thought time.
Precisely. It might need to run through more ticks to get to a good answer.
That sounds like a really smart way to handle varying levels of complexity without explicitly programming how much thinking should be done for each input. It just emerges naturally from the loss function.
Exactly. The researchers point out that this leads to a form of adaptive computation. The CTM implicitly allocates more or less computational resources in terms of internal ticks to different data points.
Yeah.
And that's a highly desirable trait in AI, right? Efficiency.
Absolutely.
And it's quite remarkable that it seems to arise as a consequence of building this more biologically inspired, time-centric model.
Okay, so we have this time-aware architecture and a really smart way to train it. How does the CTM actually perform on real tasks? Let's start with image classification. They tested it on ImageNet 1K, correct?
Yes, they did. Now, it's important to frame this correctly. The researchers weren't necessarily aiming to beat the absolute state-of-the-art accuracy on ImageNet 1K.
Right, it's a proof of concept for the architecture.
Exactly. Using a ResNet 152 backbone, the CTM achieved 72.47% top 1 accuracy and 89.89% top 5. Now, those numbers aren't record-breaking in terms of raw performance.
Compared to highly optimized classifiers, sure.
Right. But the significance lies in how the CTM approached the task. It was leveraging its neural dynamics for classification in this novel way.
Okay, so it's about the innovative approach, not just the final score. What did they discover by analyzing the CTM's internal thought dimension, those ticks, when processing these images?
Well, they analyzed how the CTM's confidence, its certainty in its predictions, evolved across those internal ticks. And they observed that the certainty generally increased over time. It suggests the CTM was indeed, reasoning or refining its understanding as it processed the image internally over these ticks.
So more thinking time led to more confidence.
Generally, yes. And this observation led to the idea of using a certainty threshold for adaptive computation.
Ah, like we just discussed.
Exactly. If the CTM reaches a certain level of confidence early on, say after 10 ticks instead of 30,
you could stop it early.
You could potentially stop the internal process right there and get a prediction without using all the available internal ticks, saving compute.
That circles back perfectly to the adaptive computation idea. And how reliable were the CTM's confidence levels? Calibration can be a real issue with deep learning models sometimes.
That's a great point. Interestingly, the CTM demonstrated good calibration of its predicted probabilities. And what's more, this calibration actually improved over the internal ticks.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's a valuable characteristic. It means the CTM's confidence in its answers is a more trustworthy indicator of whether they're actually correct. The researchers even presented visualizations of the post-activation neuron dynamics, showing they were quite diverse and structured as the CTM processed images.
And they didn't just look at the final output, did they? I think they also tried to understand what the CTM was looking at during its internal processing using attention.
Exactly right. They visualized the attention weights across the internal ticks, and they found that the CTM appeared to, follow a process. It seemed to sequentially attend to different regions of an image over time.
So it wasn't just one static glance.
No, it seemed more like a dynamic exploration, focusing on different salient features as its internal thought unfolded across those ticks.
It's almost like it's actively scrutinizing the image over time. That's a very different way of processing visual information than a standard feed-forward network.
Okay, so it can't see. What about planning and navigation? They tested it on 2D mazes, which seems like a very different kind of problem altogether.
It is indeed a very different challenge. The 2D maze task was specifically designed to evaluate the CTM's ability for complex sequential reasoning. Planning, essentially.
And the setup was deliberately challenging. The CTM had to output a sequence of steps up, down, left, right to navigate from a start point to a finish point in the maze.
Right.
But crucially, they disallowed positional embeddings.
No coordinates.
No coordinates. This forced the model to develop an internal world representation, a kind of cognitive map, just to understand where it was in the maze and where it needed to go.
Wow, no GPS allowed. It really had to internally figure out its location and its goal. How did it perform compared to other models like LSTMs?
The CTM significantly outperformed both LSTM and standard feed-forward baselines on this task.
Really? Significantly?
Yes, not only could it solve the mazes it was trained on effectively, but it also demonstrated a pretty impressive ability to generalize to longer and larger mazes. So trained on 39 by 39 mazes.
It could solve bigger ones.
It could solve much larger 99 by 99 mazes it had never seen before. This strongly suggests it had learned a more general procedure or strategy for maze solving, rather than just memorizing specific paths from the training data.
That ability to generalize, especially without positional info, is really significant. And what did their visualizations of the CTM's internal process look like in the maze environment? Could they see it thinking?
They could. They showed visualizations of the CTM's attention weights. And these weights seem to methodically step along a plausible path through the maze, almost like how a human might visually trace a route before moving.
Like planning ahead.
Exactly. The researchers linked this to the concept of episodic future thinking, suggesting the CTM was internally simulating potential future states or steps to decide on its next move.
That's a fascinating parallel to human cognition. It's not just reacting to the immediate cell, it's anticipating future possibilities. Now, they also compared the CTM to humans on a more standard image classification task, CIFAR-10, right? How did that comparison go?
Yes, they did. On CIFAR-10, the CTM achieved competitive test performance. And again, it showed good calibration, which held up even when compared to human performance on the same data set. They also did an analysis looking at performance in relation to difficulty. They used a harder version of CIFAR-10 called CIFAR-10D, where images are ranked by human perceived difficulty.
Okay.
And they found that the CTM's uncertainty levels tracked similarly to those of humans. It became less certain on the examples that humans also found more difficult.
So it wasn't just getting the answers right, it also seemed to struggle or be less confident with the harder questions in a way that mirrors human difficulty. That's another really interesting point of convergence. And what about those neuron activity patterns they showed for CIFAR-10? Did they look different from LSTMs?
Oh, yes. The visual comparison of the neuron traces between the CTM and an LSTM baseline on CIFAR-10 was quite striking. It revealed that the CTM exhibited much richer and more complex neural dynamics, even on this relatively straightforward image classification task.
It really seems like that core characteristic, the dynamic internal activity, is a consistent feature across different kinds of problems, from images to mazes. Now, to really understand the CTM's inner workings, they conducted some ablation studies, right? Tweaking different parts of the architecture. What insights did those provide?
They did. Ablations are always revealing. They investigated the impact of varying the number of neurons, which they termed model width, on both accuracy and the diversity of neural activity.
What did they find?
They found that increasing the width generally improved accuracy, up to a certain point, as you might expect. But it also led to more diverse neural activity patterns, suggesting the CTM could encode more information or more complex states in its dynamics with more neurons available.
Makes sense. Did they look at the number of internal ticks too, like giving it more thinking time?
Yes, they examined the effect of the number of internal ticks, essentially letting the CTM think for longer. They observed that more ticks generally led to better accuracy, particularly on harder tasks.
Okay, so longer thinking helps.
But interestingly, they also noted the emergence of potentially two distinct periods of high certainty during the internal processing, especially with more ticks available.
2 periods. What might that mean?
Well, it's speculative, but it hints at the possibility of the CTM engaging in different internal processing stages. Maybe an initial assessment followed by some kind of refinement or verification stage, especially when given more time.
2 phases of thinking. That's quite suggestive. Very interesting. Now, the CTM isn't limited to static inputs like images. They also explored its ability to handle sequential outputs, right? They looked at sorting and parity tasks. How did that work?
Yes, they adapted the CTM architecture to generate sequences as output, not just make a single classification. In the sorting task, where it had to sort a sequence of numbers,
Okay.
they observed these intriguing patterns in the wait times. That's the number of internal ticks it effectively spent processing or deciding on each element in the sorted output sequence. And these wait times seem to correlate with the change in the values being sorted. It spent more internal time on elements that required bigger jumps in the sorted sequence.
Huh. Like it was taking more effort for bigger rearrangements?
Something like that. Then, in the parity task, where the CTM had to compute the cumulative parity, whether kind of one so far as odd or even, of a binary sequence.
A classic sequential test.
Exactly. It outperformed the LSTM baselines they tested against. And again, it showed improved accuracy with increased thinking time, more internal ticks.
And it didn't just solve the parity task. I remember seeing something about it, learning different strategies for doing so, which is really interesting from an interpretability standpoint.
Exactly. That was fascinating. They even illustrated how one CTM seemed to learn to process the sequence forwards, calculating parity as it went. But another CPM learned to attend in reverse order to compute the final parity.
Wow.
It highlights the CTM's capacity to not just find the solution, but potentially develop and execute a coherent strategy even when multiple valid strategies exist.
So it's not just a black box giving answers. You can actually get a glimpse into its internal reasoning process, its chosen method. That's cool. Now, to really test its memory and computational abilities, they designed this Q&A MNES task. What was the goal there?
The Q&A MNIS task was specifically designed to assess whether the CTM could first remember previously seen MNIS digits presented in a sequence.
Okay, memory.
Second, retrieve specific digits based on an index provided in a question.
Retrieval.
And third, perform simple modular arithmetic operations, like addition modulo 10, on those retrieved digits.
Memory, retrieval, and computation. Quite a combo.
Exactly. And the crucial aspect here was that the digits it needed to recall for the question were often outside the immediate processing window of the CTM when the question was asked. So it truly had to have stored that information somewhere internally and then retrieved it effectively. It demonstrated a form of working memory.
Like a working memory that can access information beyond just the most recent inputs. How did it perform on this more demanding task? Did it manage?
It did quite well. The CTM demonstrated a strong ability to recall the correct digits and perform the required arithmetic, again outperforming comparable LSTM models they tested.
Impressive.
And they even provided an example trace of the CTM's internal processing, showing how it seemed to compute each step of the arithmetic operation sequentially, as the index and operator information were presented in the query.
It's like you could see it internally stepping through the calculation. Get digit A, get digit B, add them, take modulo 10. That's a pretty clear indication of something akin to sequential reasoning.
It really is suggestive of that, yes.
And finally, they even explored applying the CTM to continuous interaction and reinforcement learning environments. That seems like a whole different domain again.
It is, moving into decision-making over time in an environment. They tested the CTM in classic RL environments like Cartpole and Acrobat, and also a navigation task in Minigrid called 4 Rooms.
Okay.
The key aspect here was that the CTM maintained its neuron dynamics, its internal state, across the different steps or interactions within the environment.
Ah, so its thought process continued from one action to the next observation.
Precisely. This enabled it to learn policies based on a continuous history of observations and its own internal state, rather than just reacting solely to the immediate state, which is crucial in partially observable environments.
So it wasn't just reacting to the current situation, it had this memory trace, this internal dynamic state influencing its decisions. How did it compare to traditional recurrent networks like LSTMs in this RL context?
They found that the CTM achieved comparable performance to the LSTM baselines in these partially observable settings, where remembering past information is critical for making effective decisions.
It's a competitive performance there, too.
Yes. And again, the visualizations of the neuron traces in the RL tasks showed those characteristic rich and complex patterns in the CTM, suggesting it was leveraging its internal dynamics effectively to learn strategies for controlling the agent or navigating the grid world.
It really seems like this core architecture, with its emphasis on temporal dynamics and synchronization, is surprisingly adaptable across a really wide range of challenges: vision, planning, sequence generation, memory, computation, RL.
It does seem quite versatile, doesn't it?
Yeah. Now, as we begin to wrap up, how does the CTM relate to broader trends in AI research? And what are some potential future directions for this kind of work? Where does it fit in?
Well, the researchers connect their work quite nicely to related efforts in areas like adaptive computation, which we've discussed,
Right.
iterative reasoning, where models refine answers over steps, and the growing field of biologically inspired neural dynamics. The CTM clearly aligns with this trend of moving beyond purely static feed-forward processing and incorporating more dynamic, temporal, and perhaps more brain-like elements into AI models.
So it's part of a larger movement.
I think so. And they really emphasize the intuitive perspective and the potential biological plausibility of the CTM. They argue that its closer resemblance to biological processes might be a significant advantage in the long run for building more robust and general intelligence.
And they have some exciting ideas for where this research could go next, right? What are they suggesting?
Absolutely. They propose several interesting avenues. For instance, investigating the use of those synchronization matrices themselves as a form of associative memory storage.
Using the correlations as memory. Interesting.
Exploring plasticity and learning mechanisms inspired by Hebbian principles, neurons that fire together, wire together, maybe even moving towards gradient-free learning eventually.
Wow, okay.
Leveraging the high-dimensional synchronization space for combining different types of data, like vision and language multimodal modeling, and perhaps most intriguingly, training the CTM not just on static data sets, but in continuous, more naturalistic worlds where it has to learn and adapt over extended periods. They also made a brief note about how their initial attempts using the raw activated latent space directly for some of these mechanisms were problematic, and how synchronization provided a more stable and elegant solution.
So it's not just about getting incrementally better results on existing benchmarks. It's also about laying the groundwork for potentially more biologically inspired and maybe more generally intelligent AI systems down the line.
Precisely. The CTM represents a really novel approach. It underscores the potential benefits of drawing inspiration from how our own brains function, particularly in how they inherently process information over time.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive today, the continuous thought machine is this really innovative AI architecture that places time and neural dynamics right at its heart. It uses things like neuron-level models and neural synchronization to generate this internal thought process unfolding over discrete ticks.
That's a great way to put it.
And this leads to these fascinating emergent capabilities like adaptive computation, spending more time on harder problems, robust memory, and even hints of interpretable reasoning, like we saw in the maze navigation and parity tasks.
That's an excellent summary. And the potential significance here, as the paper suggests, is that by looking towards these biological principles, we might actually be able to overcome some of the fundamental limitations we currently see in AI, and potentially move closer to more flexible, general, human-like intelligence.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given how explicitly modeling time and these neural dynamics seems to unlock these new capabilities in the CTM, what other biological principles might hold the key to even more advanced AI in the future? What aspects of our own intelligence are we still overlooking that could inspire the next wave of AI breakthroughs?
It certainly gives you a lot to ponder.
It does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the continuous thought machine. We definitely encourage you to explore the research paper we discussed today if you want even more detail, and please continue the conversation.